Go. Okay.
Hello, welcome to Beaverdale Books. We're pleased to offer tonight's program with Raheem Bauer. I did it. Before we begin, I would like to mention a couple of other events that we're going to be hosting this week. Oh, we have a little feedback. Tomorrow night, we're welcoming Ed McConnell with his new novel, Radio Free Pittsburgh, which is an action-packed novel set in the 60s. And then on Thursday, we are going to host Judge Charles C.J. Williams. You do not want to miss this one. He's going to share his true crime story of a monster in Mount Pleasant about actual murders that took place in Mount Pleasant. C.J. is now a federal judge, and this is his first book, but we're really excited to welcome him. Joining the conversation tonight is Max Mowitz, executive director of, that's what I get for ex-director.
Bad way to find out you're funny.
That's what I get for abbreviating. Executive director of OneIowa. Max is also a board member for the Iowa Trans Mutual Aid Fund and is a gender transition doula from right here in good old Des Moines. Max.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I think our board would be worried if I was the ex-director. But yes, I'm so excited to be hanging out with you this evening. So tonight's program is focused on the Mental Health Guide for Cis and Trans Queer Guys, which is a safe, inclusive space to examine, understand, and heal from systemic and interpersonal threats to mental well-being. I'm really excited to chat about the book. I got a lot out of it. And so this book is based on proven effective cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. The book provides proven effective tools and exercises to help readers reflect on, confront, and manage difficult emotions, improve self-image and self-esteem, and develop healthy coping skills, which I think we all need, especially right now. And of course, Raheem is a clinical social worker and psychotherapist from Toronto, Canada, and he is a clinical supervisor, facilitator, and public speaker, university instructor, writer, and host of the CBT Dive podcast. So just a couple of things. He is trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, Gestalt, psychoanalytic, and sex therapy approaches. His clinical practice and writing explore the intersection of systemic oppression and mental health, while also honoring innovation in queer relationships. Please join me in welcoming Raheem.
Thank you.
So I'm so excited to dive in and ask you a couple of questions about the book. This was really, really fun to chat about, but of course, y'all that are hanging out this evening, happy to have you all ask questions as well. But of course, I have some thoughts and ideas from having read the book, but I am curious what led you to writing this book in this current moment, and also how you think this book's importance has shifted even throughout the last 6 months.
Okay, great questions. The second part of that is a bit loaded, but I will do my best.
Yes.
So I envisioned writing this book back in, I would say, 2022, maybe even a bit before that. So I used to do workshops and presentations on queer men's mental health, and largely the communities I was working in were communities that were serving guys into guys, or men who have sex with men, and that, like, it can be expansive, and sometimes it can be very limiting. But I found that when it came to mental health, we often centered sexual health and HIV, and if we didn't, it was hard for people to see the relevance. And so I really think, like, the legacy of AIDS, the experience of sexual health is like one of the many determinants of queer men's mental health, and our lives are so much more than that, you know? And so for me, I think about, like, pre-coming out and the dominant culture and all the messages it gives us that we internalize about how to be in the world, what's expected of us. A lot of that has to do with, I mean, almost all of it has to do with gender, but it's also milestones, it is caregiving, it's intergenerational expectations. And then we come out into a queer world, and I use come out loosely, like if you feel better about yourself and you connect with your own people, you know, that's a form of coming out. And then you're socialized into this new world that has its own norms, an own way of being. And so I've been thinking a lot about mental health in terms of navigating our dominant culture and our subculture that we operate in.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us a lot of different messages, and one isn't necessarily more liberating than the other.
Yeah.
You can feel trapped
Mm-hmm.
in any corner, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so when I think about like social determinants of mental health for queer folks, and I think a lot of what I write about can be applicable to more than just guys into guys, but I framed it that way to not overstep, because I really don't know. You know, when I step into queer women's communities, I feel like they've done a lot more work already around certain things, and then like cis gay men culture has just not done that work. They like to talk about body positivity, for example, but like they're still at the gym and on diets, which is like fine, but it's just very different. So anyway,
Sure.
all that to say, thinking about these determinants, I think about like internalized shame, coming out, sexual health, grief, grief and disenfranchised grief around masculinity, aging, access to healthcare, all kinds of things that determine our mental health outcomes. And so I wanted a book, and I wanted a thing that talked about our mental health not as diagnostic labels, but features, elements, things that occur in our social environment that influence our mental health outcomes.
That makes sense. And actually, so one of the things I did want to ask about that you just touched on is how you led to framing this around what it means to be like a guy and a man. And so I know you talked a little bit about queer women's spaces, but how do you feel like this book and what you wrote about interests with folks that are on the gender spectrum in a variety of ways? And do you think that, I mean, I think that there's a lot of value in having gendered spaces specifically for like healing and what that looks like, so that we're serving, but also to have that available to folks that are that express gender in many different ways. And so all of this is to say, I'm curious, besides you know, you saying that there's been different work in different communities, what else led you to frame this from a gendered perspective?
Well, so depending on where you are, where I have been in the world, my entry point into social services, into mental health programming, has been through like HIV-funded organizations, largely. And in the West, or a lot in the, very much in the global North, that includes cis gay men and trans guys into other guys, or queer trans guys. And so that has been the world I've operated in quite a bit. And so that is the language and the lens that I took. And so throughout the book, you know, there's case scenarios that talk about experiences of gender dysphoria, experiences of relationships between cis and trans folks. And so I try my best to represent a variety of experiences, but I think I don't know that it would hold or be of like as explicit value if somebody were mostly in a community of queer women and identifying as non-binary, or somebody who, mostly that. Because when, you know, when I talk about geographies, I lived in South Africa for a year, and it was really interesting to see that trans guys weren't super part of queer men's communities. It was a lot of gay men and trans women that were hanging out. Even in like a bathhouse that I went to, there was like trans women. And so it, like, I also see that gender is done differently in different places, and how it's understood, and how people, and when I think about mental health, and I'm talking about subcultures, right? So our larger culture is going to inform who we spend time with and what the norms are in that community, right? So trans guys who are operating in a culture or subculture that's mainly created by or cultivated by cis gay men are likely going to take on or experience things around HIV-related anxiety, risk, the specific nuances of substance use that are particular to that community, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think, like, a lot of the book can be relevant to a variety of people, but if we're thinking about demographics and cultural experiences, I think it's this guys into guys, which is like not perfect, but the best I could do in terms of framing.
Yeah, and what I am hearing from what you're saying is also like framing it as a way to understand like a shared experience and not to exclude communities. Which I think was really interesting because I don't identify like as a man, but I feel like I got a lot out of reading through the book regardless, because if you haven't read the book, for those that are watching, one of the things that I think is really cool is that each chapter has like prompts and exercises that you can do, and so I felt that this was relevant even for me without that experience, and so I think that that was something that was really of a lot of value, because I do think that books like this can feel a little theoretical if you don't have that way to personalize it. Was that, well, I have to imagine it was intentional, but how did you get to some of those prompts, and what kind of led you to that part of the book?
Yeah, so the prompts that you're referring to, first of all, I just want to say, I feel like I got the Max approval, so that's really great. The prompts that I think you're referring to are like the digging deeper section.
Yes.
And so that is where psychoanalytic thinking comes into play. And I think when people think about psychoanalysis, they think Freud, something backward, something stuck in time. And that's not quite contemporary psychoanalysis. And we do contemporary psychoanalysis every day when we're on TikTok and Instagram, because all you have to think about to tap into a psychoanalytic way of thinking is the impact of childhood. Just to say that, like, childhood is important, probably has an impact on who you are, how you show up in the world. Some of your early attachment experiences or caregiver experiences could be a parent, grandparent, extended family, teachers. So those relationships with role models or elders, caregivers can be important. And then there's something about the unconscious, like defense mechanisms, the way we rely on, denial, avoidance, projection, all kinds of things. And I think in our world we speculate on that all the time, when we're like, I was really nice to that person. I don't know why, I really hate them. And you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's called a reaction formation. You did something to make yourself, anyway. So the digging deeper in each section is to get us to think a little bit about earlier experiences, attachment, figures, and the unconscious. And so that's something you could do on your own. That's something you could do with a trusted friend. It could be brunch conversation if you want. It could be something you take to your therapist if you want it. And so for me, it was really important to not just, like, I think CBT is great, but I think it's really important to be more expansive. A lot of people's brains don't work in that very linear way, and even, evidence-based is something I cringe at sometimes, because I'm like, according to whom? So, because, like, for example, almost nobody talks about Gestalt therapy as being evidence-based, but in all my years of doing therapy, which is about 15 years, when I ask clients, like, what stood out to you in our time together, they often talk about the Gestalt, like role play exercises, the empty chair work. And I'm like, that feels like good evidence that it's impactful, So anyway, I've gone off track, I think, but that's where the prompts came from. My desire to contextualize the way we talk about early childhood. Because in popular culture, everything is like a trauma response, and like, that's fine, it probably is, but it's useful to contextualize it a bit.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought that up too, because something I thought was really interesting about the chair exercises, I've never done that, but I do love therapy, do love that. And I really enjoy working with my therapist in like an IFS, like internal family systems context. And so it felt like it very much like mirrored that in the way that we'll talk to like our parts. So in case folks are not familiar, IFS, or Internal Family Systems, focuses on your different like parts within you and how they all interact to protect you or show up in different situations. And so it felt like this was a way of talking about similar things. Do you feel that that's true? You're obviously like the expert here.
No,
I am not a
that's-
therapist, but so curious.
That's you're right. Oops, you're right. So so IFS is great. He was created by that Schwartz guy. I forgot his full name. But
Richard.
oh yeah, Richard. I just forgot his
I'm
name.
very invested.
But it does, and yeah, he's got unique language for like your firefighters and your protectors and all that. I would say that it strongly borrows from Gestalt because in Gestalt is about completing a connection. And in completing a connection, this parts work, in Gestalt we were talking about it as working with polarities. So I'm talking to, the part of me that is anxious is talking to the part of me that is adventure seeking. The part of me that wants closeness is talking to the part of me that fears being trapped, So these become the different parts of you, and you embody them in the chairs, and then you speak to your other part. That's one iteration of the chair work. That is more complicated than most of the things that I have in the book. Most of what I have in the book is you're talking to one other entity. So the other entity is like an early version of yourself, what people might call inner child. It could be an older version of yourself. It could also be unlikely conversations. So like your childhood bully, a parent who you have unfinished business with, which was like everybody. It could be a deity, it could be a god or something. It could be a body part.
Sure.
So, if you're doing, like in the body conscious culture section, there's like, you find a body part that you're critical of. And, you have a conversation with that body part. What do you thank it for? When are you critical of it? What are the kinds of things you say when you're mad at that body part? How does it let you down? If that body part were different, how would your life be different? And then you switch chairs and you embody the body part. And then you're like, tell this guy over here. Like, how does it feel to hear that?
Sure.
And what feelings come up for you as the body part when you're letting your person down? And it's the purpose of this kind of dialogue is to bring these kind of disparate or fragmented parts a bit closer together, and to articulate and bring to the surface a relationship that you have with your body. So for example, I've done a lot of chair work with every part of my body, and the thing I realized, every time is that my mind is often so disconnected from the rest of my body, because when my body part talks to me, it always says things like, I'm doing what you told me to. I do a lot for you.
Sure.
You put me through a shit ton. You expect a lot out of me, and then you criticize me for not being able to keep up. And reflecting on that, I think about what it really means for when people talk about like the capitalist grind, or when people talk about fat phobia and like body fascism. That language like really, it lands in a particular way when you think about how you talk to your own body. So anyway, that's an example of what Gestalt can look like. You could also put in the empty chair a substance, like drugs or alcohol. I've had many a conversation with alcohol. She's my friend, she was. But there's a lot of grieving that has to happen with the thing you're putting into the chair, and you can't otherwise explore that relationship without, that surplus reality that gets created when you do this kind of exercise.
Yeah. Well, and I am glad you brought that up, even with things like sobriety, because we just before this we were talking about how we're both sober, and now as you're sharing that, the thing that I keep getting led to is what does it mean to talk about alcohol or substances and do the chair method and understand how it was trying to show up for you. I think so
Yes.
often in sobriety there's a lot of black and white thinking and moving, like pushing whatever the substance was away as such a negative and bad thing, and certainly that can be true, but in what ways did it show up for you? And I think that a chair exercise could be really edifying. So yeah, that's really cool. I was just thinking about that as you were chatting, and is food for thought for me as well as a sober person.
I think it's a thing we all could benefit from, right? Like there could be a thing that it could be a number of things. So for us, it happens to be alcohol, but something that you rely on, that serves a purpose, that makes you feel great, but also makes you feel bad. And when the consequences of feeling bad gets bigger than the good, you're thinking about it more deeply, right? And you're often thinking like, why do I keep returning to you? And what's safe about this thing that's so dangerous? I think there's other things we can think about in a similar way. And so, yeah, it's helpful to think about, again, it's your relationship to alcohol as opposed to, CBT, which is evidence-based, is great, but it focuses on behavior change. This is about what is my relationship with this thing. I remember my psychoanalyst, I said to him, he said, Raheem, what is it that makes you want to open a bottle of wine or crack into something when you get home? And I'm like, I just feel like it motivates me. I get home, I dig into something, and I take that first step and I feel at ease. And he was like, okay. And when you're at ease, what is then possible? And who are you? And I'm like, I feel like I'm me, but just a different version. And so he was like, okay, so it helps you switch headspaces.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah. And so then he said, so it just helps you connect with yourself. And that really took me aback because my story around alcohol was, this helps me connect with other people.
Oh yeah, okay.
And I had a pal that I worked with at a health center in Toronto. She was Indigenous, a Métis queer woman. And I was telling her about this, like, my analyst said, like, the alcohol helps me connect with myself. And she said, well, that makes sense because, that's the goal of colonization. It makes you fragmented, and then it maintains a fragmented self because the system benefits from that. And so then alcohol, it makes us think that we're less fragmented or we're more whole. And I thought, that blew my mind, because I thought, like, it's quite the systemic analysis to bring to something that I just thought was like my fun friend. My friend that I hang out with in private, my friend that I hang out with in public. In places that it's socially sanctioned. So, all that to say, the Gestalt conversation can go far. And if you feel safe enough to let other people into that conversation, they can give insights that are also super powerful.
Well, and I think that that's such a good point too, especially as you think about the way we have to navigate like capitalism, and you often have to be a very different person outside of your home than you are in. So that makes a lot of sense, and honestly kind of leads me to another question that you've actually mentioned a couple of times, kind of tongue-in-cheek, that like CBT is evidence-based versus something that's not. And I think about this a lot because what it means to be evidence-based usually means that there's data, and so often when we look at that, that's really based on like standards, like very white supremacist standards around what is valid, really invalidating very rich and robust histories of how we care for each other. And so when you were writing a book like this or on this book tour, do you find that you often have to, kind of place that asterisk or like say those things in order to feel like what you've seen in your 15 years is valid, even though you're seeing it in real life?
I don't always. This is maybe the first time I'm doing it, but that is, I'm in a room full of people that are queer in a way that I know they've got an analysis about all the things. So that's my assumption. And I'm just like, so I just feel like I gotta, anyway. But
great vibes, great vibes.
Yeah, I'm like,
in a loving way. Yeah.
So, but here's the thing. I think that it's so important that we think about community care in addition to individual interventions. I think it's important that, you know, we allow ourselves to learn and increase our mental health literacy in all the different ways that we do, but I really think social media is not we can't rely on it for total support. And so I think these things that have more of a foundation provide a lot, right?
Sure.
If you're not ready for it, or if it's not coming from a safe place, it'll fall flat and it can even be harmful, you know? So I think about like body image, for example. If I feel like I hate my body, or I feel like there's a chapter on managing rejection, because I think we're all on dating apps. Like earlier today, I got in, I went on Sniffies, which is this app that's just like butts and genitals, or like, you know, that's how you pick. Anyway, there's a person like 500 meters from me. Meters? Do you guys say meters? Anyway, that's what my app says, meters. And
It's
so,
tracking.
okay, great.
Yeah.
And I was like,
Yeah.
oh hey, you're so cute and so close. And he's a white guy, and the first thing he says is, oh, I wish it wasn't so close.
Oh, oof. What?
And I was like, oh. And so I
Okay.
sent that smiley face, which is like the, because you could have just not responded.
Yes. Yeah.
So, what is my point? My point is that if I wanted to process this in therapy, it could be hard if the therapist was both white and denying that there's possibly an experience of racism. Like, I also don't know, like, this is the thing about racism and microaggressions, and you know, it could be femphobia, it could be racism, it could be, well, I don't know, I think those two things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if somebody wants to help me make sense of it without creating space for recognizing my reality, or creating space for like a kind of grief around what I'm not, you know, or the masculinity that isn't, or the thing that I'm not, the thing that they have to say after that might be a miss, if that makes sense, right? So I think while there's so many things that are evidence-based or shown to be helpful, my point is that psychological safety is really important. And I think where your information is coming from, like the person it's coming from, their position is going to make a difference. And so I think the relationship is going to be very important, you know, in that regard. I will say the CBT asterisk, I've seen a lot on social media recently with, you know, wars everywhere, people feeling the pressure of it, especially if you're from a diasporic community, and they'll say things like, well, CBT can help gaslight you through this experience. And
oh my gosh.
we've all seen that meme. And so the thing is, that is CBT done poorly, because what they're referring to is working with unhelpful thoughts or thinking styles. So yeah, if you have like a global overarching thing that says like, I'll never be loved, or like, people always reject me, or this person rejected me, that means I'll never meet anybody, or there's an ongoing war right now, my people are being bombed, and that means nobody cares about me. Like, all of those things skew toward a thinking style that likely is unhelpful because it's got a few holes in it. It's not a complete, full, it's a statement about how you're feeling in the moment that is a bit of a generalization. And so you can work with those thoughts to see if you can alter them slightly.
Yeah.
Now, if something is factual, then you don't tell somebody they have an unhelpful thinking style.
Yes. Yeah.
That is, that's not nice.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be helpful. But instead, with CBT, you do the problem-solving method, which is about looking at your thoughts, but also trying to figure out what you want your goal to be toward wellness, right? So, you know, for a lot of people I've talked to, they're like, this person disrespected me, or the way that they broke up with me, or rejected me, or ghosted me was unkind, harmful, abusive, you know? So I'm not going to be like, well, was it abusive though? Like, that's not the way to go, right? And so I would say that is factual. Let's talk about the feelings and thoughts, but then I want to talk a bit about your goal in terms of what's possible for you, right? And so people will say, my goal is I want to be heard, or I want closure. And then we'll say, okay, what are all the options? And we'll list like 4 or 5 things, and I guarantee you 3 out of the 5 things will not be about closure. They will be about hurting the other person back. And that's okay, because you want to go through that process to say, I can see that there's a lot of pain here, and you wish that person could see it. But that doesn't align with your goal for closure necessarily. Because if we follow through with these strategies, there's a chance you might feel more hurt, or you might not get a response from the person. So problem solving is about connecting the thoughts with goals and then evaluating options. And you have to do it, like, it takes some skill. Anyway, this isn't in defense of CBT. This is more, well, I guess it is, but it is like knowing what tool is appropriate for the context. And most of the CBT tools I have in there, some are thought analysis, thought records on helpful thinking styles. A chunk of them are problem solving. Because, like, the shit we think is facts. Often, you know?
No, I think that's fair, and makes sense, and thanks for your, like, perspective or thought on that. I know that there's so many different ways to try to move through the current moment, and that's putting it lightly, but, like, it's interesting because one of the parts of work that I spend the most time in is, like, trans healthcare and mental health care in Iowa, and what you've said is really interesting because there is, I interact with a lot of trans and non-binary and gender diverse folks that go to a therapist to talk about what's happening in our world, specifically in Iowa as we lose civil rights and experience really high levels of transphobia, and so many of them will email me saying I need a new therapist because they don't understand what the problem is, or they're not willing to, like, work within that person's lived experience or framework. So what you said really makes a lot of sense to me, and I think is a huge gap in healthcare right now for LGBTQ people in general.
Yeah, like, if somebody doesn't share your identity and they tell you you're catastrophizing, you're gonna have a meltdown. That's an appropriate response. And because the truth is, like, we're not catastrophizing, but also we have to create a bit of space in the moment of urgency to actually think about, what is our day-to-day life going to look like? Are we getting through? What are the indicators going to be that something else needs to happen? Can we step outside of the urgency to make, like, optimal use of some of the resources we have? Like, we need to create a bit of a space to think, and I think when we're being minimized, I'm saying we, so I'm not a trans person, but when our people in our community are feeling minimized, or their concerns are feeling minimized, that it's the least helpful starting place, because the threats are very real, right? And for somebody to, when somebody minimizes something, I know I often feel like when people say things like, oh, that's how the world is, or, you know, that's just how wars happen and people die, that's normal, and I'm like, it's common. It's common, but, like,
doesn't make it right.
It's like, I'm having a lot of feelings about it, and I don't love that you're just like, that's how the cookie crumbles. Like, that's, ooh, snorted. That is, it feels like a gut punch in a way that it goes from urgency to being deflated, as opposed to urgency to, like, nurturing, calm spaciousness for thinking. You know? So I think it's these trajectories that we need to think about for mental health.
Yeah, that makes sense, and it makes me think a little bit too. I'm curious. I recently read and saw a session from the person that wrote Decolonizing Therapy, who talks a lot about, like, ancestral rage and how to respond with rage and anger to what's happening in the world. So it's funny that you bring that up, because it's so strange if somebody truly normalizes what's, just because it happens a lot doesn't mean it's okay, and especially if you are, like, a very principled person or someone who is impacted by this harm, which most people are in some way, shape, or form, that can just feel so invalidating. So I'm curious, like, is there an element of that in any of the work that you do, like kind of ancestral rage, or, like, how things have been carried through your family, or is that a little bit?
So there's a chapter where I talk about family and culture, and then there's another chapter under disenfranchised grief. I talk about masculinities, neurodivergence, and legacy of AIDS. I know it's like they seem unrelated, but in my mind, I'm like, grief. So, in those sections, I tap into the lessons we've learned or things that we inherited through the ethos of our families that, you know, some that we want to carry with us and others, you know, that maybe work against us.
Sure.
I don't talk about spirituality or like ancestry in the way that that particular author you're talking about. I see their work a lot. I wouldn't say that my work, it doesn't look at decolonizing in the same way.
Sure.
I think I would be more likely to think about legitimizing and affirming people's rage and taking a step away from respectability and like there's not one way to further your cause. But I've found, you know, there's a crossroads with clients where we're like, do you want to honor the way you show up in the world and accept it? Or are you coming to me because there's a lot of feelings and fundamentally there is something you want to change?
Yeah.
And so it's a kind of a tricky place that I don't think it's a different approach that is not always it's not going to be talked about in the same way from a complete decolonizing lens.
Sure.
Like for example, you know, a lot of gay men will come in and want to talk about body image, and like they'll be like on diet or going to the gym, eating weird protein things, like strange, honest to God, strange things.
I've been known. It's
I was gonna say shut up.
I'm a protein sweetie. So
Okay, yeah, like it's
reporting for duty.
and like they're always drinking a thing. I don't get it. Whatever. I do get it, but it's like it stresses me out.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, like I've been with other therapists who are like, oh, I would have a conversation with them about, you know, being in a fat phobic culture and how fat phobia is connected to racism and misogyny, and I'd be like, oh, I would not, because that feels like I could do that later if they're interested.
Sure.
But that really is so my agenda, and that is me wanting affirmation. That's me. I'm looking for collusion. I'm looking for a person who wants to celebrate bodies with me in a certain kind of way, and that's just not their agenda. And I want to find out, like, if your plan for body modification, like if your plan for sculpting your body in a particular way, if you were to continue to follow that, what do you hope would be different?
Sure.
And for a lot of people, the answer is like proximity to other people. I'll get more attention, I'll get more love, I'll be liked. I think for queer folks who might not have the same trajectories as our cis and straight counterparts, the body project can also be a place where we invest a lot. In psychoanalysis, that defense would be like compromise formation. For the things that I can't do, I'll invest in this thing that I can.
Yeah.
So if I'm not going to have the child, the family, the house, the double income, this is a thing that I can visibly, it's a marker of my work, discipline, progress. Even if it's founded on something problematic, it signifies something. You know? And so I'd be like, okay, let's do the thing. Like that is your life. You're allowed to invest time in the things you want. And then my question would be like, is it serving you?
Sure.
Because sometimes the rigidity around those rules get in the way of the very thing we wanted, which was the connection.
Yeah.
And how does your rigidity around body and those rules, how does it get experienced by the people you're with? Do they celebrate you? Do they feel ashamed of themselves? What does it bring into the relationship? You know? So all that to say that I like the decolonizing therapy model. I think it brings a lot of space for like ancestral knowing. I also think like there's an idea about what liberation looks like that's suggested by people who talk in that way that can sometimes miss the mark of like how people are like want to critique a system but also want to participate in it. You know, like I want, like I could say not the version of me now as much, but a younger version of me was like mad at racism, but also wanted white guys to be attracted to me, you know, or to look my way. So, and I think we have to create space for that reality.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. No, and that's really like a good way to frame it. And I know that I have asked a lot of questions and spoken a lot so far. And
we're doing great.
Honestly, we're off on a tangent from what I even thought I would ask about, which is very good. I'm a Capricorn, so I was like, I have 85 questions. And like, you've taken this in really meaningful directions.
And I'm a Leo rising, so I was like, just going to perform about a thing and it'll be fine.
Yeah, here we are. So with that in mind, I say all of that because if y'all like have questions or things that have popped up here in the crowd, like has anything like piqued your interest or that you want to ask about? Not to put you on the spot.
God, just so many things.
Yeah,
I just am taking it all in.
Yes.
Just so much of what you're saying is landing.
If you want to glance through
I
it,
would like to glance through it. Thank you.
that
I know a
might
place that you can buy the
inspire
book.
questions.
Just everything with CBT and my weird double feelings about that. And I don't have a question. I just have a lot of processing.
Okay.
So it's all just.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I just thought I'd check in just because I know. Well, that's lots of
Because you're a
Don't
good
worry, give me
facilitator.
like 5 minutes.
Oh my
I
gosh.
have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, how do you think you can share this book with people that aren't trans or gay?
Yeah.
And because I find this conversation fascinating, and I can relate to parts of it too. But how do we get the word out?
Yeah.
That's the tricky part.
You know, I think so. At the moment, people are getting more comfortable saying, "Okay, I have depression sometimes," or "I'm depressed now," or "I have anxiety," and that's good in terms of breaking through a stigma around mental health. But I think it's not as nuanced as it could be. And I think if we think about, like, each of us can think about the communities we operate in and what are the things that really influence how we feel about ourselves. So I think we have to define mental health first. And the way I think about mental health is like, how do I see myself? What is my perspective on other people and their approach toward me? How do I see the world? What is my relationship to emotion? Do I see it as a barrier? Do I see it as is it getting in my way? Is it something that guides me? And so, if we think about that complexity of what mental health is, and then we think about what goes on in our environment and in our community that influences it, we're in a much better place to tackle what I would call the determinants of our mental health outcomes. So, you know, like I talk about heteronormativity and challenging it. Frankly, there's a lot of like cis women who struggle with like wanting to have children or not wanting to have children, not wanting it, and they get a big critique from everybody around them, unsolicited, I'm sure. No, I know. And then, you know, people who want children and aren't able to have them and have to do other technological things like IVF or surrogacy, and that also comes with a critique. But you know, if you ask that person, so the cis woman trying to have the child who's not able to without external interventions, like when your body's not able to do this thing, how does it make you feel about yourself? And what do you worry other people will think about you and your marriage? And, you know, and people have things to say, you know, like, I'm not functioning, I'm not proper, I'm not a suitable wife, all kinds of things. And if we take it a step back and we say, okay, who in your world has given you this message that your function is reduced to this outcome? And who reminds you of that? And what do you want to tell them? They could be in the empty chair. They could be part of our CBT problem solving for like what we're going to do, right? Because that's the environment. That's the subculture that tells you, not just like, tells you what progress is, what milestones are, but also how to properly be a woman. just like painful,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so that is also, if a cis straight woman were doing that, that is also resisting a kind of heteronormativity that I think is important. So I think people have to think about in their own community context, you know, and that's why somebody had said to me, like, why didn't you do a book on LGBTQ? And I'm like, yo,
That is
like, I
too
just
big of a
don't know,
scope. What do you
like,
mean?
like, I know queer women,
You're just one dude. What day?
but like, I don't know, like, their worlds are different. Body image is different. Connection seeking, casual sex, like, it's all different.
Flirting.
It's all different.
Well, and I think that that's a really interesting point too, because I think there can be sometimes systemically or culturally, there's like this concept that men are not like an important part of the conversation, or like doing healing work with men is not like valid or needed, and so I think that that's important because so often I think men can be dehumanized in a lot of different environments, and we are in a moment where we can't really dismantle systems that ultimately benefit, like especially cis white men, without them having an understanding of how it also harms them. Like there's not an oppressive system that doesn't also harm the oppressor, and so I do also think that like it makes a lot of sense to me that this is specific to an identity and an experience or part of an experience, and that's like really fruitful, so to speak, for that community. So
We've got another audience question.
I just want to make a comment because I'm watching the Facebook watchers,
Yes, yeah.
and so far, I mean, I'm assuming, but they're all women's names. So there are lots of females watching this this event, and I find that, I think, to be a good thing, that they want to understand.
Women read.
Yeah,
That's
they
what I-
do.
That's what I was about to say.
They do.
But
Yeah.
also, you know, I think I hope the value of having a self-help book is that for guys who would benefit but can't access therapy, whether it's money or stigma or, you know, the context of their relationship or how they see masculinity, whatever it is, hopefully the book can democratize or make more accessible, you know, these kinds of tools. So that could be helpful.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's also something interesting about, like, a lot of my audiences, there's been a lot of trans folks, non-binary folks, cis women. The gay men have come, but there's been a big contingent of, like, all of our other people as well. And I think when I think about people's roles in movements, I think there's some people who are great at collecting information, integrating it, applying it to themselves, and then knowing who to take it to. You know? So I'm confident that everybody is operating in some way to support one another.
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, well, and I'm curious, you've talked about it a little bit, and something that did keep coming up when I was reading is that idea of grief too, and you bring it up a few times, and I think that's especially salient in our current moment when we're experiencing a lot of grief, not only around what's happening like internationally, but also within like the United States specifically, and this kind of dismantling of many systems that have existed for a while. And so I'm curious, in the past few months, do you feel like the conversations around grief, specifically as it relates to the book, do you feel like they've shifted in any way?
Yeah, sorry, you had asked me that earlier, so I'm so glad you circled back to it. I think that, you know, grief, I think, is ongoing. It's everywhere, it's all the time, you know? It is, like, in a small way, you show up at the bar and nobody's there. And you were like, I was going to make out with somebody today, I just knew it. You know? Or like,
Specific grief, yes.
yeah, but grief is our response to loss. And loss happens in the imagination, in fantasy, in relationships, in our expectations around relationships that come from our early attachment experiences. So when we experience disappointment, which a lot of us do regularly, that is also a kind of grief. So the grief that we're talking about here, I actually don't think it's that new to a lot of queer and trans people. And not to minimize it, but because what's going on is significant, but the kind of, if grief is a response to loss, what we've lost is a sense of security around citizenship. And I think, you know, I remember years ago, so I'm born in Canada, and years ago, there was a drag queen in Toronto that did a drag performance in like a hijab and had bombs struck to her. And she didn't know why this was Islamophobic. And then lots of people in the community were like, oh, like, that's what art is. And I'm like, no, this is stupid. But the kind of, I spoke out against it, and then the kind of backlash I got, it really shook something in me. And when I talked to my friend who is from the Middle East and living in Canada, he was like, I don't understand why you're so surprised. And I think the difference is that him having immigrated to Canada and me having lived, like, been born there, I had this illusion of a kind of citizenship. And I think, you know, when you criticize the nation, instead of being grateful for it, if you are not part of a mainstream or a dominant voice, people want to make you feel like they're stripping you of that citizenship in a number of ways, you know, not necessarily taking it away. So I think that's the kind of loss we're experiencing right now. And it's destabilizing, but I don't think it's outside the realm of our memory, of our being. It does, however, you know, when I think about, like, people who are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who lived through the AIDS epidemic, and the kind of homophobia that they internalized, you know, going to a homophobic church or going to a psychiatrist at a time when homosexuality was in the DSM. Even though they came out and things have changed, the shame that they carry is lifelong. And so for this moment, the things that people internalize because of the environment, the things that they have to repress, that also won't be undone, you know, by another executive order. Like, that will, I don't know if it'll be lifelong, but it takes time, right? So the impact will be there. The imprint of it will be there. I don't know what else I could say about grief. I think, like, when I talk about grief in this book, a lot of it is about disenfranchised grief. And that is specifically grief that is not socially sanctioned in a way that's recognized. And I think that is what, like, that's what we all live in. Like, I can just imagine we all live in that all the time, you know? And that is like a family member not recognizing your milestones, you feeling overlooked when you're celebrating like some straight cis person's milestone. Like, they're good, you're happy to be there, but you feel something, you know? It is feeling good about being non-monogamous or poly or being unconventional or innovative in your relationship model. And still part of you longing to wish you could, your model of kinship could be recognized by other people. You know, all of that is grief. So I think we're familiar with grief. I think we need to create space for it, self-compassion for it. And then to think about how we weave that grief into our culture, because to grieve is to also, it demonstrates our capacity to love and care. So if we're feeling things deeply, that also means we have a lot of capacity.
No, I like that too, because I loved when you talked about milestones and typical milestones as well, especially with disenfranchised grief. It really made me think of how strange it was when I tried to get top surgery for like 3 or 4 years, and I really struggled with insurance. I had a date, everything was going good, and insurance rejected it, which is something that like we're seeing a lot in Iowa right now as trans folks are losing access to gender affirming care through Medicaid, for example, or trans youth aren't able to access it at all. And so I bring this up because that day that I got the call was just like devastating, and it was a feeling of grief, but so many people I talked to about it were like, oh, you'll just get another date and it's not a big deal. And so I think that that's a good moment of like, no, this isn't
hip surgery.
Yes. No.
Which is also bad. You don't want to say that too long, but it's
shout out hip surgery, but yes,
the meaning ascribed to this is
exactly. And so I think that that's so valuable, and it makes me think also of thinking through the ways that like when you talk a lot about AIDS and HIV, it makes me think about all of the people in those that we've lost, like their chosen families that weren't given a moment to grieve their friends at a visitation or funeral because they weren't allowed to be in there or accepted. And so that really resonates for me as well, and how we navigate that as a community too. So that's just like so meaningful, and I've never seen somebody write about it like that before. So I think that's just very cool.
Thank you.
Yes. But yeah, so, and I'm curious again, I'm happy to open it up to y'all, like any other like thoughts or questions that are popping up for y'all. I also have no concept of time because I am very neurodivergent, so I don't want to keep people too long. I will yap all night, so.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm gonna try really hard to string a coherent question together. I have 4-month-old twins at home, so forgive me. So much of what you're talking about resonates with me as like an adult person and like my own personal experiences. But the question that I'm going to ask you is maybe not what you intended for like the audience of your book, but my job is working with queer and trans youth. And so, but for my own like professional knowledge, but also maybe for some folks who are joining us on Facebook, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way you see some of these lessons applying to young people, particularly just those of us who are in space with young queer people often, and how we might just like facilitate some of that growth while we are not mental health professionals, if that makes sense. You know, you've talked a couple different times about being able to intervene in mental health determinants, and so how do we as adults in those spaces help facilitate that growth? And then also, you know, we're talking a lot about grief, and I very much, again, as me, like this adult 32-year-old person sitting here, like I very much agree with you, and I think that's really potent and it resonates with me a lot. And then I also think about the middle school students who I work with who have never known a world where they have not had those rights, and so it really is, their whole context for this is just the removal of them. You know, they haven't lived through the fighting, the getting, and now the taking away, and so I just think the context is a little different. And so I would just love to kind of hear your thoughts on those things.
Totally.
Yeah.
So, okay, each chapter of this book has a set of complimentary like worksheets that you can download for free off the New Harbinger Publications website. And in those worksheets, there are specific prompts for that go beyond, like, the book will give you examples of how to work through a situation, and and then the worksheets help you do it on your own, right? Now, I think if you're a therapist or you're a group facilitator, you could say, we're going to workshop this and turn it into a series of like sessions. If you feel less comfortable taking a mental health angle or doing it, you know, from a clinical perspective, you could read parts of the chapter that describe the determinant, like what is internalized shame. That is when we devalue ourselves, or evaluate ourselves negatively through an external person's gaze. Maybe you'll find simpler language, or maybe I've found simpler language because they told me to rewrite everything to make it simpler over and over. So hopefully, it's, you know, and to get people to think more deeply about where they do that. You know, when I think about like sexual health, for example, sexual health is not about chlamydia and gonorrhea. Like, I don't care about that. I mean, it's fine. Like, I just don't care that much about it. I think more about when we have like low risk but high anxiety, or we worry about what it means to be HIV positive or to be with somebody who's HIV positive, right? That is all about the social world and the meaning we ascribe, the way we moralize things. And I think a lot of queer and trans folks think about sexual health way earlier than their cis and straight counterparts because we have to. And part of why we have to is we're isolated, so we look on the internet for people and information. And if we're on sites or apps that are like for dating but are also like skewed toward hookups, that conversation is ongoing. And so I think even talking about like, so my point, I do have a point, talking about what people's experiences are and how they've had to learn things on their own. Like they might learn about like the language around vaccination and sexual health from a dating app. That might be their first entry point, potentially, you know, or a hookup or something like that. So I think using these as like giving it a topical outline and then thinking about how people can bring their own experiences to it could be really helpful. I think one thing that's not in there that, you know, might be its own thing is how people engage with social media. And because when I think about a social determinant of health, it's not like employment, you know, you're like, if you've got it, life could be better. If you don't have it, life will be tougher. That feels a bit black and white. This isn't about having something or not having it, it's about how you move through it, right? So with social media, really, like, for a lot of queer and trans people, that's how they connect with the world. It's so, it's like a life-saving intervention, you know? So you can't just be like, no screen time. Like, we have to think about it in different ways. Similar to like connection seeking, I don't think it's about being in a relationship or not being in one. That's so beside the point. It is, you live in a world of complexity. Some people will tell you, you might want a long-term relationship and to get married and to have kids. You might say, oh, that's for straight people, I don't want to do that. Either way, you're gonna feel like potentially you're missing out on something else, or you are subject to criticism by your peers. There's a conversation to be had there about what that climate and that context is like. So I think people can bring their own experiences. I'm very like in the millennial age range, or born in '85, so a younger generation is going to have to bring their own experience, I think, to the book and to the determinants as they see them.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't even have a question. I'm trying to have one, but it, like, my brain is all over the place. But just like so much of what you are saying makes so much sense, and I'm going to try to form a coherent thought. We'll see. It's the end of the day. But like fully, I came here for me and like my relationship to all of this, but I work in behavioral health, and so a lot of what you're talking about, I'm like, okay, now I can relate this to my job. Or at least it ties into things that I've thought about. So definitely, like, one of the things, like the first thing that you said about how you even got into this, where you went into spaces and it was all focused on HIV prevention and like that's it. Or your point about sexual health is not just gonorrhea. Like, you know, most of my clients are either autistic or have a TBI. And in doing, like, okay, I'll directly quote a person from a CEU that I went to on sexual health and relationship education. And the first thing that she said was like, raise your hand if in this room, if anyone in this room, if 100% of your sex life is not masturbating in public and how to put on a tampon, put in a tampon, whatever. And like, everyone was like, no, that's ridiculous. But like, that overlaps where it's like our need to pathologize, like the more marginalized someone is, the more we pathologize one thing, you know, and then like you kind of lose the whole person. So it's like, and I'm not like trying to explain your book to you. This is just where my brain is.
I think this makes a lot of sense. I think so. You had said TBI, so for folks who don't know, like traumatic brain injury, and with that comes a difficulty, like in making certain connections. So like, if you told me not to do something in this context, I'm not like, just because this is a public space, I'm not going to know that I can't do that same thing at the restaurant next door, because you're making a connection that these are both public spaces and this is not a good idea there. And I'm thinking, you said no here, but over there is okay. I think we absolutely need to create space for people who are processing things differently and are not intending to do harm. Yes, there's like norms around what's appropriate and not, but like, we're in America where people think they're so progressive, but actually they're so like, so Puritan.